So, moving on to this evening's talk by Dr. Eric Covey, revisiting George Bethune English in the Ottoman World. Um, Eric Covey is a faculty member in Brooks College of Interdisciplinary Studies at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. He received his doctorate at the University of Texas in Austin. He served as a Fulbright US scholar in Nigeria, and he is the author of Americans at War in the Ottoman Empire, US Mercenary Force in the Middle East. And it's drawing on that he will address us this evening. Eric, over to you.
Pardon me. Thank you, Quentin. Thank you, Quentin and Craig, for making this happen today. I know Craig and I have been going back and forth for about 3 years, with the pandemic and a whole kind of host of things. So it's very gratifying for me to be here today to talk about this part of the book. Uh, and of course, thank you all for attending today. So as Quentin alluded to, the talk I'll give today is part of a much larger project, that book, Americans at War in the Ottoman Empire, that I published with IB Tauris in London about 6 years ago. And that book examines a collection of encounters between the United States and the Ottoman Empire across the 19th century that were mediated by different mercenary figures. So, for example, the first chapter in the book deals with the U.S. war with Tripoli, 1801 to 1805, but specifically that 1805 occupation of Derna by the U.S. when former consul to Tunis, William Eaton, recruited about 300 mercenaries in Alexandria, marched across the desert, and occupied Derna for, I think, about 2 months. And then the final chapters of the book deal with the 50 former Union and Confederate soldiers uh, who went to Egypt in the 70s and 80s to essentially attempt to reform the Egyptian army. And a little known fact, like on the eve of the bombardment of Alexandria, for instance, the head of the general staff of the Egyptian army is an American, a former Union general. So in between, I examined a whole host of kind of other incidents. This talk today is based on the second chapter of that book that deals with the U.S. attempt to establish sovereignty by uh, getting the Ottoman Empire to recognize equal commercial footing for U.S. flagged vessels in its ports, passage through the Dardanelles, and so forth. And I was excited to revisit this chapter because I wrote the book a long time ago, or it feels like a long time ago. And in the meantime, before I came to Brooks College at Grand Valley, I had been teaching in the history department at the university, and I had taught history in Abuja and so forth. And I had been teaching a lot of biography, so especially African women's biography and history. And when I wrote this book and when I talked about George Bethune English originally, I hadn't given a lot of thought to biography. So I was excited to kind of come back to this chapter and to think about not necessarily how this chapter fits within my larger argument about how the U.S. Establishes relations and also ideas about the Levant, about the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa, but just about kind of George Bethune English's biography, his life. So I'll apologize in advance. I don't really have any slides. There's no illustrations. We're, early in the 19th century here. I wished I had an image of George Bethune English. That would be immensely satisfying to me, but I don't. So I have a much, much abbreviated version of the chapter here, focusing on his biography, and I'll just start right in. Uh, so George Bethune English was born in Boston in 1787 to a middling family, well respected but not well off economically. He did graduate in 1807 from Harvard and subsequently pursued and rejected the practice of law, though he never reflected in writing on this career. A year after he graduated from Harvard, he sent a letter to Senator John Quincy Adams, who will appear throughout this biography. And Adams had probably been his teacher at Harvard. English wanted to apologize for asking for a reference without first notifying Adams. And he had apparently supplied Adams' name to the Secretary of War, hoping to secure a military appointment. So he didn't want to be a lawyer, but he wanted to join the military. The appointment never went through. Military expenditures at this point in the U.S. declined during Thomas Jefferson's presidency and following the end of the war with Tripoli. So instead, English returned to Harvard, where he took an interest in Judaism, another kind of thing that animates his biography. In 1812, he won the Bowden Prize for his thesis titled The Origin of Masoretic Points and Their Subservience to a Thorough Knowledge of the Hebrew Language. He briefly trained as a Unitarian minister, but was unsuccessful and dissatisfied. And shortly thereafter, he renounced Christianity and he published in 1813 The Grounds of Christianity Examined, which forever changed his life and trajectory. The Grounds of Christianity Examined barely registers on most historians' radar, but it's at the height of the Second Great Awakening. The book produced a major controversy among New England Protestants. In Boston, the book was important enough, or perhaps seen as dangerous enough, to merit a response from three significant figures in Unitarian theology, including Edward Everett, who will pop up again in this story. So while individual ministers attacked him from the pulpit and in print, English faced off also with the Church of Christ, which voted to excommunicate him. So he's in kind of dire straits in Boston at this point. Uh, so because he challenged the liberal theology of Unitarianism that undergirded the Boston social order, which was responsible for much of New England's economic expansion, English found himself marginalized, either willingly or because the influences of his friends finally had some effect. He left Boston and published nothing else in the United States till 1823. So, to some degree, he drops off the map after 1813. According to several sources, he had some role in the Harmony Society's colony in Pennsylvania. This was a utopian community. Uh, but for whatever reason, he gave up on Utopia. He had also apparently been involved in a printing press venture, but that's not well documented. Uh, in any case, he decided to come back to military service. And there's a need because while the Church of Christ was debating his rejection of Christianity and apostasy, the British were burning public buildings in Washington, D.C. He must have had some support still in government at this point because in 1815 he finally did receive a military appointment when President James Madison nominated him as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps 2 weeks before the Treaty of Ghent was negotiated. Uh, so by the time he's commissioned and assigned to Marine Corps headquarters, the Washington's over. There is still a need for Marines, though, on U.S. naval ships because there's a brewing conflict at this point with Algeria. During the war with Britain, U.S. relations with Algeria, which had been quite good for some time, had suffered. The Algerians had captured several U.S. flagged ships. So once the war with Britain ended, the United States undertook a naval expedition against Algeria. This is essentially a naval expedition that never ended. The Mediterranean Squadron, I think now the Seventh Fleet, has maintained a presence in the Mediterranean for now over 200 years. So by the time he sailed for the Mediterranean, though, the U.S. Had signed a treaty with Algeria. So appraisals, he still ends up, of course, in the Mediterranean. So appraisals of this phase of English's life in the Mediterranean must remain conditional, for he's largely absent from the archives from 1815 to 1818. One biographer who knew him claims the life of a sailor agreed with him as it, quote, placed him amongst gentlemen, which was gratifying to his taste, and it is said he was a favorite among them. He was well liked by all these kind of people who did meet him. He was charming and could speak different languages and apparently was very clever. He was a member of the Hasty Pudding Society at Harvard, which is a kind of poetic performance club. And life in the Mediterranean squadron after 1815 with no war was likened by some sailors to membership in a yachting club as the fleet just cruised from port to port. The Mediterranean offered more to English, though, than just kind of life among other men and kind of sailing around. It gave him the opportunity to explore the contemporary theological and political landscape of the Levant, which had fascinated him for many years. Now, he probably arrived in Egypt in 1818. I've read in one source, although they didn't have a source, it was just something they said, that in 1817 he was in Tunis. He took an extended leave from the military. He ends up in Istanbul, Izmir, and then he goes back to Egypt, perhaps. His kind of travels are unclear. He did 6 years later tell Adams, though, that he had been in Istanbul 6 years before this. So he's really kind of getting around largely on his own, it appears. There are a few other clues about what he's doing in the Mediterranean at this point. In February of 1819, a curious report appeared in the Christian Messenger. This is a Middlebury, Vermont newspaper. An anonymous author claimed that English had, quote, embraced the Mohammedan faith at Constantinople. Whether this is true, I'm fairly certain it is not, or slander is impossible to know. It is curious to note, though, that in 1819, Edward Everett was also in Istanbul. So it's possible that this is something that Edward Everett contrived. So he does return to Egypt, though, in 1820. And in 1820, he's one of at least three, I think probably only three Americans who took part in Muhammad Ali's campaign to pacify the Sudan and extract its resources. English was employed as an advisor to Ismail Pasha, Muhammad Ali's son, who's leading the expedition into Sudan, based on the recommendation of Henry Salt, the British consul in Egypt. So English arrives at Wadi Halfa, for all practical purposes, the edge of the Ottoman Empire at this point, in October 1820. 5 days after his arrival, he suffers a bout of ophthalmia, and he took laudanum, a strong narcotic, immediately falling a week behind the primary expedition into the Sudan. So a narrative of the expedition to Dongola and Sennar, which he publishes later in London and in Boston, is English's opiate-fueled account of his trip up the Nile and one of the first descriptions of the Sudan by an American. It begins with a brief biography of Muhammad Ali and the troubles on the Upper Nile. And what's interesting is that this kind of quest for the source of the Nile, which animates so much of the kind of Western writing in the middle of the 19th century later on, this kind of dominant theme in these narratives of African exploration, English really shows little interest in this. He doesn't care about the source of the Nile. He's more interested in the kind of like the history of this place. So far from home, he transforms the Egyptian landscape into a metaphor for his own troubles. Quote, the Nile resembles the path of a good man in a wicked and worthless world. Long before Joseph Conrad described the trip up the Congo River as, quote, like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, English described the trip south into Central Africa as, quote, presenting an epitome of the moral history of man. English praised the ancient Egyptian and Nubian civilizations and credited Ethiopia as the originator of sciences and institutions transferred to Egypt, then Greece and Rome, and finally Europe, lamenting that, quote, the people who now occupy the territories of nations extinct or exterminated have profited neither by their history nor their fate. What was once a land occupied by nations superstitious and sensual is now inhabited by robbers and slaves. So this inaugural account of the Sudan by an American then documents the opening moments of colonialism in the Sudan, Egyptian, of course, and then British, following hundreds of years of the trans-Saharan slave trade. It also is this moment of the intensification of that trans-Saharan slave trade under the Egyptian Muhammad Ali. So when the Egyptians finally arrive at the capital, there's no battle. English lamented again, quote, finding this once powerful city of Sennaar to be almost nothing but heaps of ruins, containing in some of its quarters some few hundreds of habitable but almost deserted houses. He goes on to describe the ruins of a great city with marble monuments and an impressive palace that's now in bad shape. The only real kind of hostility he observes in Sennaar was widespread anti-Christian sentiment, probably owing to a long conflict with Abyssinia to the east, though most of the inhabitants had never actually seen a Christian. So English seems overwhelmed with what's taking place around him. This invasion led by Ishmael is quite brutal, uh, and involves widespread social disorder and violent atrocities. English witnesses this kind of stream of what we would recognize as war refugees, forced resettlement, In one passage, he reports the return of one expedition with 350 enslaved prisoners from east of Sennar. Among these, three chiefs, two of whom were impaled in the public square. Uh, English recoiled from this brutality as one dying man chanted the Shahada until he was too weak to do anything but spit at the invaders, while the other chief reportedly called the Egyptians robbers and murderers. So it's not very long he's there before he requests to be sent back to Cairo due to his ophthalmia. So, English was still in Egypt in 1821 when the Greek Revolution began, shifting relations among the Ottomans, British, French, and Russians, and that may have been one of the reasons he ultimately left, although there was also some kind of pay dispute with Muhammad Ali. Pay disputes are another thing that seems to kind of animate English's biography. Later on, he has some pay disputes with the US government. In September of that year, before he left, English met the German missionary Joseph Wolff on a boat from Alexandria to Cairo. The two were acquainted for a few months, and English is a frequent topic of Wolff's journals as one of the members of the circle of Europeans around Henry Salt. And Wolff apparently also tried to bring English back into the Christian fold, but failed at that. So finally, in March of 1822, English left Egypt for Malta, where he spent several months in quarantine with the missionary Pliny Fisk. This is not long after Levi Parsons had died. And again, Pliny Fisk is writing to his sister and to others and talking about English and his attempts to convert him back to Christianity, which again failed. So before he returns to the United States, English traveled to London, where the first edition of his narrative, that narrative of the expedition to Dongola and Sennaar, was published anonymously. The book was dedicated with affectionate respect to Henry Salt, whom English called his, quote, fatherly friend in a foreign land. Though he published the first edition of the book anonymously, English was not unknown in London. He had been described in a recently published travel narrative by George Waddington in 1822. And there's a dispute here because Waddington apparently also claims that English had converted to Islam. One of the things that English talks a lot about is his ability to travel in the Oriental garb, the ability to kind of pass. Uh, and but English takes exception to this account of him having converted to Islam. And then later on, when he publishes the first edition of his book in the US, claims that Waddington apologized for this. So contra so many accounts later on that English had converted to Islam or, was the first American Muslim or all these things, throughout his life, if we actually look at the evidence, he constantly rejected that idea. In fact, many details of his life seem to suggest that Judaism is where his kind of strongest beliefs lied. So by November 1822, he's back in the United States, finally, after having been gone for 7 years. In an article titled The Apostate, the Alexandria Herald of Virginia announced the return of the Bostonian, quote, whose eccentric conduct has attracted so much attention. In February of the following year, Wells and Lilly published the first edition of his narrative. It had been advertised several other times by other publishers, but there hadn't been, I guess, enough subscriptions or interest to actually publish it. The new edition that he published included a map from an English map, perhaps one by Henry Salt, additional footnotes, including the footnote about these other two Americans who were part of this expedition to the Sudan, one of whom died on the Nile. The other one, it's unclear. I can't find them anywhere else in the archive. And then appendices containing descriptions of the Sudan from other travelers. So he is very much providing knowledge, as it were, about the Sudan, about the Levant, about the Eastern Mediterranean to Americans. The publication of this narrative received much attention. Predictably, reviews were mixed. One reviewer said the book would, quote, naturally excite considerable attention thanks to the eccentric genius and extraordinary adventures of this young man who is our countryman. Another review claimed that the book was terribly written and would embarrass Americans. would be embarrassing to Americans in terms of what American literature looks like. So the British would think this was very bad. The narrative, nevertheless, was excerpted in US newspapers, accounts of Turkish customs, descriptions of Berber and the Berber people. This circulated throughout the early republic. Now, thinking about the larger kind of geopolitical picture at this point that English's biography is happening in 1821, the year before he returned home, the United States had failed in its initial effort to negotiate a commercial treaty with the Ottoman Empire. John Quincy Adams, who pops back up again here, was very he's the Secretary of State at this point. At this point, his influence on James Monroe's foreign policy is significant. He had sent Luther Bradish to negotiate in Istanbul, but Bradish found very little success. Like many Americans, he was uncomfortable with the tribute system, and the Ottoman Porte was wary of negotiating with the United States, in part because of British advice, but also because it suspected Americans of aiding Greek rebels. In St. Petersburg, U.S. Ambassador Henry Middleton, another very influential figure on Levantine foreign policy at this point, uh, and a vehement anti-Ottoman, he opposed quasi-diplomatic missions like these because he thought they endangered U.S. Relations with Russia. But for whatever reason, Adams was either willing to suffer reduced friendliness with Russia, he was perhaps willing to abandon his Philhellenic allies in the United States in order to get access to the Black Sea, or he just didn't care about the consequences of the Treaty on International Relations. Uh, the US is already kind of negotiating a thin line and balancing its relationship with Istanbul and St. Petersburg. The two empires have fought three wars in the last 50 years. And then, of course, following the beginning of the Greek Revolution, this balancing act becomes even more tenuous. And there seems to be evidence that the Russians wanted to draw the US into a war against the Ottomans. Uh, the Russians offered the United States a wide-ranging treaty, but the president and the Secretary of State rejected it, hoping for a strictly commercial treaty. This is always the thing, even with the Ottoman treaties. They want a strictly commercial treaty that doesn't really involve any kind of other obligations. Uh, Edward Everett at this point, again, for the kind of backdrop of what happens next, Edward Everett is making his way into government. He's a vocal supporter of the Greeks. Nevertheless, the U.S. continues to pursue relations with the port, kind of passage to the Dardanelles, access to those Black Sea ports and products is really important. And English figures significantly in all this. So in March of 1823, English went to Washington, and there, in a letter to Adams, English proposed expanding with the Ottoman Empire. He claimed the port favored expanding relations with the United States based on its good experience with American traders at Ishmael. Uh, and English attempted to mobilize his experience, not merely as someone who could pass or move effortlessly through the Ottoman Empire, but as a person with real connections there, to secure a position negotiating equal commercial footing. In his account of the possibilities of Ottoman commerce, English claimed the Ottomans were increasingly drawn to the United States, especially since the 1812 war with Britain had demonstrated, quote, the growing power and great importance of the new nation. Furthermore, and related to his own troubles in the past, English positioned the United States as a secular power, which is a kind of very interesting move here. Further arguing that, quote, European nations who monopolize at present the trade of those ports are considered by the Ottoman government as the natural enemies of the empire. Commerce with the United States would ensure stable prices for the Ottomans when the nations of Europe were embroiled in war and U.S. vessels were the only neutral flagged ships in the Mediterranean. English emphasized his vital connections to the Ottoman world as well as his ability to pass as a Muslim, and describes his unique pedigree thusly. And he's speaking in third person. The undersigned believes that the circumstances of the last 6 years of his life give him advantages over every other American citizen as a medium of obtaining such a privilege from the Ottoman government. Having lived among the Osmanli for some years, he is familiar with their character and customs, has many acquaintances of high rank among them, has served in their troops, and contributed essentially to the glory of their arms, all of which are circumstances obviously calculated to secure the favorable consideration of what he might propose to them. Now, later on, some kind of mid 20th century historians will claim that he was a kind of secret agent, and this was all some kind of long-term plot that was, hatched and perhaps orchestrated by Adams. There's no evidence of that. Uh, so English proposes that he's going to travel to Istanbul, quote, appearing only in the oriental dress, I should be lost among the crowds of the immense city and escape the notice of the Europeans who reside there. In Istanbul, English proposed that he would approach Muhammad Husrev Pasha. This is the Capudan Pasha, the head of the Ottoman navy and absolute authority in the empire's ports. And English argues that for Husrev, that facilitating this treaty would quote, gain for his country the goodwill of a people, the Americans, right, destined to one day become the most powerful of all the nations of the West, and whose amity might hereafter be of value to himself in a pecuniary way. So one of the kind of things that also animates this book is so many of these figures, like English, are almost unrepentant American exceptionalism, exceptionalists. He's certainly someone who believes the United States is a secular nation, but definitely believes that it has this kind of great destiny. So for doing this work, for securing a treaty, he asks for $2,000, which is quite a lot of money at this point, to support a 2 or 3 month stay in the Ottoman capital to do this business. Just a few days later, Adams replies and approves this mission, but wants it to be kept quiet, which is a problem. 2 days later, English gets a passport. This all happens very quick. He gets a payment of $2,000 and heads out on a 60-day trip from New York to Marseille, where he's in quarantine from a bit. April 6th, he's in Paris. At this point, he writes to Adam with an update. uh September, October, and then 3 months later, I don't know what he does in Paris. He's in I don't know if he's in Paris, but he's certainly in France for well over a month. And then in November, he finally arrives in Istanbul to presumably attempt to negotiate this treaty. So he began his mission by furnishing a small apartment, and then in a letter dated to Adams, November 23, he described Istanbul as tranquil, which he attributed to the end of the Ottoman War with Persia and a brief respite from the troubles with Russia. He reported that the Ottomans continued to resist Greek independence because they knew the Greeks were, quote, destitute of money and divided among themselves and discontented with their chiefs. But his faith in a kind of imminent Ottoman victory seems to have faltered at this point, and he doubted assessments that the Greeks would shortly surrender. Uh, he did remain confident that his mission would be successful. He reported that the Sardinians, 6 Sardinian flagged ships had recently gained access to the Black Sea. And he reported that Husrev, who he had actually met in Istanbul, would be arriving back from Greece soon. He continued to gather intelligence on the state of the Ottoman Empire. In another letter, he reported on the Egyptian contingent of the Ottoman army, which had been extremely successful in the Aegean. But he decried the state of this war, again, like he had in Egypt. He said, quote, this detestable war is carried out by both sides with a ferocity shocking to humanity, and which ruthlessly tramples underfoot all those feelings and principles which distinguish man from the wild beast. English observed, too, that the war had produced additional tension between the British and the Ottomans, which might be helpful, he said, to the United States. British Consul General Lord Strangford had warned British merchants in Istanbul that a rupture in relations might be even imminent. At this point, English had also developed intimate acquaintances with the librarian of the Sultan, the dragoman of the port. The dragoman, as the translator for the port, would have had significant kind of diplomatic and cultural insights into Ottoman foreign policy, and also helped English to communicate with the Reis Effendi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, with whom English said he would attempt to negotiate if his attempts with Husrev were successful. So in his previous time in Istanbul, he had obviously developed some relations with these people. I'm skeptical that many of these relations were not just simply mediated by members of the European community in Istanbul. No one's like fooled by English wandering around Istanbul. Uh, so according to the Dragoman, it was widely rumored in Istanbul that the US began supplying the Greek resistance in retaliation for the failures of Luther Bradish, whom the Ottomans believed was an official agent of the United States, not just, as Bradish claimed, a curious person making inquiries. So these attempts to establish relations with the Ottomans are always also like semi-formal. Uh, and this rumor is in part true. You know, the US was supplying the Greeks with aids, or at least Americans were supporting the Greeks, not due to any particular loyalties, but because there was money to be made. And a tide of anti-Islamic and pro-Hellenic sentiment in the United States helped to justify merchants' extra-legal behavior. The Ottomans, of course, did not accept this blurry line between citizens and government of the United States. The flag under which merchants sailed, after all, was what determined their relationship to the empire, the port, and its rebellious territories. English understood that these rumors meant he must be cautious and remain undercover. Passing had become more important than ever. He said, I am, quote, I am understood, I I understand at present, considered by the Europeans here merely as one who has traveled in the East and who visits Constantinople in an Oriental dress to have the greater faculty to observe what is worth notice. English claimed his ability to pass under these tense circumstances allowed him to go deeper into the Ottoman world than anyone else. Again, he said, quote, under favor of this garb, I penetrate almost everywhere and have opportunities of learning the mode of transacting public business of the Ottoman port, which European dress would infallibly exclude me. I mean, indeed, English thinks nothing of saying, quote, among my neighbors, I pass for an American Mussulman who has come from a far distant country to visit the capital of Islam. But English also recognized that passing was an anxious practice. He says, quote, my situation is full of danger and disquietude, and nothing but my determination not to disappoint my fault, your expectations with regard to me, is able to countervail the anxiety of the singular task I have imposed upon myself. So he sees himself as really uh, uh, responsible and kind of obligated to Adams for these kind of things that Adams has done for him. He goes on to kind of list some things here about trade and Ottoman ports. France remains the most favored nation in Ottoman ports at this point. In Izmir, Americans are paying 15% at the custom house instead of 10% like Americans. And he goes on to kind of list things that the Americans could import and export here. But he says, and this is kind of important to how the US is thinking of its relationship with the Mediterranean, with the Levant, with the Ottomans at this point. He says, quote, by far the greater part of the profits derivable from a free intercourse with Turkey would consist in freight. In other words, it would be the transportation of goods, not their sale, that the United States would most profit from. So here English invokes an already well-developed narrative of U.S. naval exceptionalism, expressing his belief that, quote, the superiority of American ships and sailors would give them an advantage over most of their competitors. And he concludes that the only thing preventing the United States from enlarging its commerce in the Ottoman Mediterranean is European jealousy. So we have another kind of character who enters at this point, and that would be David Offley. So English gives credit to David Offley, who's the U.S. commercial agent in Izmir. For more information, English refers Adam to Offley's upcoming report, Commerce of Turkey. Offley is a Presbyterian, and he's also very suspicious of English. He had, in fact, while English is in Istanbul, Offley sends a letter to Adams accusing the former Unitarian English of having converted to Islam. So again, here's somebody who's claiming that English is a Muslim, which he says makes English a subject of the Sultan. Beyond the kind of religious prejudices and a desire to remain the pivotal figure in U.S. Ottoman commercial relations, Offley must also have been uncomfortable with the unexplained appearance of English on his way to Istanbul. English complicated Offley's long-standing business in Izmir. And in fact, the day before English arrived back in Izmir from Istanbul, Offley had been questioned by a local pasha and forced to deny that he knew anything about English except for the fact that he existed. Offley had been in Ishmir since 1811 and had almost certainly met English before when he was in the Mediterranean in the 18 teens. And in fact, I think that he may have even been involved in this 1818 report of English's conversion to Islam. Offley was likely uncomfortable to see that this kind of former mercenary in the employ of Egypt was now working as a quasi-official of state, which might jeopardize the dominance of his own business, Woodman and Offley, in the Ottoman port. So while Offley tended to his business in Ishmir, English made progress in setting the stage for future negotiations. In an 1820, February 1824 letter to Adams, he reported that in his final days in Istanbul, he was received by Husrev. Over coffee, English took a similar approach to Bradish, lying about his intent and telling the Capudan Pasha that he was in the Ottoman capital on a pleasure trip and that the government business was just a side bit, although perhaps this was true in some ways. Uh, he did suggest to Husrev that the United States desired a more intimate commercial relationship and wondered aloud what such a commercial relationship might entail. Husrev replied that no advances could take place until he investigated the Bradish affair. When they met again, Husrev claimed it was the influence of the British ambassador that caused Bradish's failure. Nevertheless, at that time, Husrev believed it would be difficult to negotiate uh, a treaty, probably because the Porte recognized the delicate state of the Aegean crisis and the perils of further endangering relations with the British over a minor treaty with the United States. And again, we're in 1824 at this point. 3 years later, the British, Russians, and French destroy the Ottoman fleet. So this is certainly a very tense moment in the kind of lead up to what happens at Navarino. Husrev, however, was willing to meet with the Commodore, the head of the Mediterranean Squadron of the United States, if the country was willing and prepared to deliver specific conditions for a treaty. In other words, he wants more than just this random American who's like, maybe we should be, friends. Uh, the perceived advantage, too, of meeting the Commodore offshore would be that it would bypass the step, first of all, of sending an ambassador, an official representative to Istanbul, which have required the issuance of a passport, would have stirred intrigue among the dragomans, the diplomats in the capital. English admitted in his letter that Husrev's conditions, this offshore meeting with the head of the Mediterranean squadron, were not exactly the results that he had promised to produce, but the best he could do at present. He concluded again that the Greek cause was ultimately hopeless and that it would only be a matter of time before the Aegean crisis ended. He goes back and forth on this. He said once things were back to normal in the Mediterranean, a treaty would be less perilous to negotiate. So he arrives back at Ishmir from Istanbul. David Offley, in the meantime, has sent that letter to Adams, and he finds when he arrives in Ishmir that David Offley has not forwarded any of the letters that he wrote from Istanbul to Adams to the United States. Offley claims that no ships had left for the United States. This is obviously a lie, right? Uh, when he arrives back in the US, English doesn't mention this, surprisingly enough, in his letter to Adams. It's almost unclear if he realized how much Offley disliked him. Uh, so back in Boston, English forwards this letter, attachments, packets of book, uh, to Washington and arranges to meet with Adams in person. Now, while English was absent from the U.S., Adams had continued to receive letters from Henry Middleton in Russia. Middleton was aware that Monroe and Adams had sent both Bradish and English to Istanbul. He opposed both missions. Nevertheless, the Monroe administration at this point continues to see negotiating equal footing in Ottoman ports as an important foreign policy priority. This is a really kind of interesting moment in American politics, although Adams writes in his journal in May 1824, after English is returned, he says, all this, quote, all this is to be kept profoundly secret. Although when you read the newspapers from the period, it's clear that the US desired some kind of relation and that English was in the Mediterranean. So this kind of casting him, later historians who cast him as a secret agent, that's just not what was happening. There was no secret here, really. So while he waited and hoped for another government appointment, English returned to public life, publishing a number of important pieces on theology and geography while growing anxious about whether Monroe would move forward with treaty negotiations. So he finally gets an appointment, and ultimately there's a lot of like waiting. And I think it takes something like 6 or 8 months until he can return to the Mediterranean after he gets this appointment. Uh, and uh, Yes, and he's just sending all these kind of panicked letters to President Monroe. But Monroe remains cautious. Uh, so, and by the end of 1824, in fact, he's writing letters to Adams like begging for money because he's going to be jailed. He must owe tremendous debts. I have no idea how he's supporting himself. He's written a number of articles about the Ottoman Empire. He's also kind of re-involved himself in this kind of theological dispute in Boston. So he has a lot of trouble in the U.S. Uh, and he's also, and I don't talk about it today a lot, but he's also deeply involved with the Jewish community in the United States and really interested in kind of Jewish theology. And that's a really kind of interesting side story you can read in the entire book. So finally, in January 1825, English receives official instructions from John Quincy Adams, who I believe is now president, who has taken over the presidency, to travel to Norfolk and report to Captain John Rogers of the USS North Carolina and, quote, perform such services as he may assign to you. For his services largely as an interpreter, although English does not speak Turkish, English would be compensated at the rate of $2,000 a year. He has to pay for his own rations. And he writes a letter to Adams around this time where he acknowledges a message he was carrying for the Commodore, which was somehow related to the affairs of the Department of State. It doesn't exist anymore. I can't find it anywhere in the archives. But English promised to communicate the message, quote, word for word as you have delivered it. Though I doubt not when you have a successor to your present office, it will be in the way most agreeable of your friends and the best friends of our country. So here English is hoping that the new Secretary of State will be someone who is also interested in this kind of Ottoman treaty and a supporter. That's not how it turns out, of course. Uh, Henry Clay shortly assumes the office of Secretary of State, and Clay doesn't support this treaty. He's a Philhellenic person, doesn't like the Ottomans. Finally, though, by August of 1825, English is again in Ishmir. The North Carolina had waited 2 weeks for the rest of the squadron by Gibraltar and then proceeded to Paros and then to Turkey in order to obtain information about the state of the Greek Revolution as well as the location of Husref. One of the unfortunate side effects of the ongoing conflict in the Aegean was an upsurge in Mediterranean piracy. So this time, the U.S. Mediterranean Squadron, it's not Tripoli or Algeria that it has to worry about, but essentially Greek pirates. The Greeks had pirated at least two U.S. ships. So providing protection to American ships around the Morea was just one of the reasons for sending the Mediterranean Squadron from Ishmir, but another one was to secure from Offley a copy of the Ottoman capitulations with the French, which several years before English had said he was going to get a copy of. So I'm not sure why he never managed to get it, but hopefully these capitulations with France would provide the basis for understanding the conditions under which negotiations of a commercial treaty might take place. Now, this is a kind of interesting moment too, because English actually takes credit in a letter to Adams for enlisting Offley into the mission, explaining in his letter how he had convinced the Commodore to be frank with Offley and take advantage of whatever services he could offer. So English implies that Offley is a reluctant nationalist, probably not untrue. He's again mostly concerned with his own commercial business, and he needed to be convinced to value his country more than his business. English says the Commodore, quote, laid such strong hands of hope and fear on Mr. Offley as will, I believe, make him zealous in aiding the Commodore in the business he is charged with. What's also really fascinating from this time is so essentially the USS North Carolina, which is the flagship of the U.S. Mediterranean Squadron, is anchored in Izmir. And English reports that the appearance of this flagship produced impressive results beyond just suppressing Greek piracy or securing treaty documents. He commented on the more tangible results, the growing visibility of U.S. power in the Mediterranean, describing the spectacle occasioned by visiting the warship as as such. Quote, with liberality and good sense, the Commodore opened the ship to anyone who wanted to see it. Visitors included Europeans, Turks, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews. In short, a large proportion of the population of Smyrna of all nations and both sexes. English went so far as to say that, quote, even the rigor of Oriental reserve has in this instance yielded to the irresistible cravings of female curiosity to see, to use their own expression, the great ship that came from the New World. Yet the squadron's most important mission, contacting Husarov and negotiating this treaty, remained incomplete. By December of that year, English is frustrated. The Commodore had succeeded in forwarding a letter to Husarov to establish some kind of channel of communications, but English is still worried that support for the Greek cause would uh, cause Adams to be indifferent to the Ottoman treaty, and he's arguing forcefully in letters at this point that the United States could not alter the fate of the Greeks, and now was the best time to engage the Ottomans because the Porte was, quote, discontented with France and highly exasperated against English. Uh, so English claims that if Rogers had been authorized to negotiate and provide with a treaty, he could have sailed to Istanbul and had it signed in 48 hours. And he begs Adams to authorize Rogers to negotiate this treaty to give him more responsibility. So 9 more months pass before he writes another letter to Adams. And by the time he writes that letter, the USS North Carolina is back in at the headquarters of the Mediterranean Squadron, Port Mahon. So English reported that negotiations were carried out in a, quote, perfectly satisfactory manner. The Commodore and the Capitan Pasha met twice. Uh, and the Kapudan Pasha promised to forward an account of these meetings to the Sultan and to address the matter further on his return to Istanbul in the autumn after the end of his campaign against the Greeks. English was hopeful that should the Kapudan Pasha retain at the end of the present campaign the same favor and influence of the Porte which he now enjoys, I think, sir, that there is every reason to believe that the reply of the Sultan will be favorable. So he's optimistic that this treaty is going to happen, and Rogers is going to send a ship to Izmir in November to get the reply from the Sultan. Well, as we know, the Greek Revolution did not conclude, drags on for 4 more years. But in February of the next year, Husarov informs Rogers that the Sultan's too preoccupied with military reforms to consider a treaty with the US. And perhaps worse yet, although he still retained the Sultan's favor, Husrev had been dismissed from naval service due to the influence of the leadership of the Egyptian contingent in the Morea with whom he clashed. In Istanbul, he was given the post of Saraskar, or Minister of Defense, but Rogers noted that unforeseen and auspicious events were going to delay the negotiations of this treaty. In the US, English's old foe Edward Everett continued to support the Greek cause, along with political notables like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, all outspoken supporters of Greek independence. So English's dream of a truly secular nation was not shared by many of his countrymen who concluded that religion alone was reason enough to side with the Greeks over the Ottomans. In Russia, Middleton continued to wish for the destruction and partition of the Ottoman Empire. Uh, and when they met at his coronation in 1826, Middleton and Tsar Nicholas, I should say, asked Middleton if the United States had an agent representing it in the port. So even the Tsar is concerned that the U.S. is trying to establish relations with the Ottomans. Middleton hedged. He demurred, said the United States had no success in negotiating a treaty with the port, so a non-issue. All right, so this marks, and I'm coming to the kind of last part of this, as it were, now. So English returns to the United States. He spent that first kind of 6 or 7 year period in the Mediterranean, and now he's returned. He's been to the Mediterranean twice as a kind of quasi agent of state. and this treaty is on hold in 1827, we're at now. So he returns to Washington in 1827. In Greece, France, and Britain objected to the surging Egyptian military power. At this point, it's the Egyptians who are really kind of helping the Ottomans in that civil war or revolutionary war, as it were. Uh, at the Battle of Navarino, as we know, eventually the Ottomans were devastated by this combined force of British, French, and Russians, which turns the tide of the Greek Revolution. In any case, in 1825, English wrote to Secretary of State Henry Clay asking for money he believed he was owed based on that agreement several years earlier, the $2,000 a year. It's unclear if he ever received it. Perhaps the year he was gone, he didn't receive it. Maybe he wanted more money. But again, he is in dire financial straits as someone who spent, seven, eight, nine, the last 10 or 11 years in the Ottoman world and is not well liked in Boston. So in July of 1828, and this is kind of 3 years into his presidency, Adams is actually preparing again. This is after the Battle of Navarino. Adams is now preparing to send English back to the Mediterranean with treaty papers to deliver to Commodore Montgomery Crane, head of the Mediterranean Squadron. So at first, there's no sign of trouble. Presumably, English has been the one involved in negotiating for so long. The Greek Revolution is now coming to an end. Navarino's happened. This treaty is going to happen. English is going to be the one to do it. So Adams signs all the necessary papers. He goes so far as to invite English to his office, and he reads out loud, and this is in his diary, he reads out loud to English his letter of appointment and instructions. In a journal entry, he records that English, quote, received notice of his appointment with expression of warm gratitude. Again, he's known English for over 20 years at this point. He was his teacher, right? So this is kind of where something funny happens. So Samuel Southard, Secretary of the Navy, had already notified the USS Fairfield to be prepared to accommodate English on its voyage to the Mediterranean. Everything's ready to go. 2 days after their meeting, uh, Adams changes his mind. He decides to send Edward Wire to the Mediterranean instead, and Wire ends up, I think, not going. My next chapter kind of deals with the final negotiations of the treaty and kind of the U.S. diplomatic presence. So 2 days later, after he's told English, you're going, this is what Adams writes in his journal. Life is full of disappointments, and among the most mortifying of them to me has been the misconduct of persons whom I have peculiarly befriended. This case of English is one of the most mortifying that have occurred. I have repeatedly procured employment for him in public service, and notwithstanding his eccentricities approaching to insanity, have continued to favor him till now. I can no longer sustain him. And I can't find anywhere in the Adams papers, anywhere else in kind of US archival spaces, what happened, why English was suddenly abandoned by Adams. What happened that after all these kind of years, Adams finally decided he was going to send somebody else. Adams declared the verbal agreement with English null and void because no letter of appointment or advance of money was handed over. He had just read this aloud to him. Wire was sworn to secrecy and told to be ready to depart in 4 days. There's no hint of what transpired to cause Adams to reverse course. He was certainly aware of all these accusations that had been leveled at English over the years, these claims that he had converted to Islam, or that he was so close to the Jewish community, or that he had rejected Christianity and engaged in this, very public theological dispute. So without explanation, English was left without a patron, and he died of unknown causes 2 months later in Washington. 3 years later, the United States finally agreed to a treaty with the Ottoman Empire, which, as I said, the next chapter in the book details. So following his death, English was favorably and widely eulogized as a singular character in the history of Young Republic. Several shorter obituaries with factual inaccuracies, typical for artifacts of this type and time, appeared almost immediately following his death. For example, a brief eulogy from the Haverhill Gazette recounts important points in English's life. He converted to Judaism, became a deist, and then became a Muslim. Again, not really true. Finally, after meeting Joseph Wolff in Palestine, he embraced Christianity and returned to Washington. He never, so far as I know, traveled to Palestine. He certainly didn't return to Christianity. Uh, Initial eulogies like this were followed by lengthier, more accurate renderings of his life. One of these, published in the New York Commercial Advertiser, becomes the basis for so many of these later ones. Uh, it described him as, quote, one of the most eccentric men of the age and possessed of uncommon powers of mind. But the eulogist also cautioned readers that the life of George Bethune English was, quote, a forcible lesson for skeptics. Uh, Nevertheless, the eulogist said, and in spite of his rebellion against common law Christianity, English was worth remembering because, quote, never was there a man more honest in his deviation from the true pathway. So in the 20th century, and I'm concluding here, in the 20th century, scholars vacillated between describing English as a secret agent and as a mercenary. One, a legitimate, if often unrecognized agent of the state, the other, a figure whose labor is performed outside the bounds of nation. In his 1928 Princeton dissertation, American Relations with Turkey to 1831, Walter Livingston Wright Jr. called English a, quote, renegade and a, quote, ideal secret agent. Renegade, of course, is a common appellation hurled against religious skeptics in general and converts to Islam in particular, but English does not appear to have actually converted to Islam, and describing him as a renegade, I think, works historically to marginalize the body of labor he performed in service of his nation. Nor is it entirely accurate to describe him as a secret agent. His first trip to Istanbul as an agent to negotiate relations between the US and Ottomans was widely reported on at the time. Pierre Crabtree, who was an American who served on the Egyptian mixed courts from 1911 to 1936, described English as a soldier of fortune and mercenary in his 1938 account of Americans in the Egyptian army. In their preface to the papers of Henry Clay, Mary Hopkins and James Hargreave followed Wright's model and described English as a, quote, secret agent. In Pioneers East, the early American experience in the Middle East, David Finney returns to calling English a secret agent while labeling the Bostonian a representative of what he calls, quote, a sort of early American awkward squad. By 1983, English was remembered as a, quote, prominent American Turkophile, a description, again, somewhat problematic linguistically due to English's own admission that he did not read Turkish. And then finally, in 2007, in the midst of the US War on Terror, the Israeli historian Michael Oren called English, quote, a young contrarian, a fair description, perhaps, but then he went on to conclude that English was, quote, a warrior diplomat in the cut of George W. Bush, a comparison that defies understanding. So, whatever he was or remains in the archive, English was instrumental in establishing US sovereignty, that is, equal commercial footing in the early years of the Republic. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric. That was fascinating. A man of mystery, our
Yeah.
mystery English.
Yeah, someone who I actually, I wrote that book a long time ago, and of course it's in my head still. But English is really the only person from that book who, like, I wonder about, like, I really still wonder, and perhaps the only segment of that book that I wished I could do more, you know?
Yeah. So now we're open to questions, comments, discussion. If you would like to ask a question, turn on your video, raise a hand, put something in the chat. While you're thinking about that, so do we know what languages English actually spoke? I mean, he seemed to spend quite a bit of time in France. Was he? Did he speak French because that was a lingua franca?
I would suspect that he probably spoke French, right? He wrote that kind of thesis at Harvard on essentially Hebrew texts. So I wouldn't be, and he had many prominent friends among the American Jewish community. So I would not be surprised if he read Hebrew. I don't know how he could have written that dissertation otherwise. And in retrospect, there are things kind of written about this kind of early American Jewish community at this point that deal with really kind of like global and, kind of longue durée questions of, Jewish theology that, and then he's kind of part of this. Like he's really interested, engaged in that. So probably Hebrew, French. I mean, he must have been in so long in the Levant, certainly the French, but I would suspect he must have understood some Arabic or Turkish, even if he can't read the languages.
Yes, yes, because it seems a little strange. I imagine you would have had colloquial Turkish, colloquial Arabic, and when he was in Istanbul, if he was talking to various people, he must have had something, or he had a dragoman, you know, tied to him who really went around everywhere with him.
Yeah, and that's what happens in a biography, right? Is like when he's writing all these letters, like he must have, like he's not just like this sole kind of individual in this apartment interacting with people. I think him having a dragoman, right, is definitely likely. Linguistically, too, there's this interesting in some of the obituaries, this claim that a delegation, I believe, of Sioux speakers had come to Washington at some point, and he interacted with them and was able to grasp their language really quickly, and they were like surprised by this. So there seems to be, at least by some of those kind of contemporary biographers of his, this claim that he was someone who was linguistically gifted. And I mean that I guess that tracks, right? He did well at Harvard. He won this award, Hasty Pudding Club. Uh, yeah.
So, do we know anything about his family? I mean, was he married? Did he have kids or anything?
He was certainly not married, no children. I mean, I think most of his time in the US was spent embattled. I would suspect as a Harvard attendee, he may have been the second son or third son. Again, his family, in one of the letters, he does, when he's in Istanbul, he writes to Adams and says, "Oh, if I die here or if I'm killed, would you please ensure that my father, who is old and like feeble and poor, that he gets taken care of?" So his mom may have passed away at that point. There's never really any indication of siblings. So like the Bethunes were a well-known family, and Penelope Bethune is his mom, and she marries, I think, English. And so they're like an offshoot of a better known family. Again, kind of at best middling, though. Uh, No, he's not kind of well documented. Again, it's like his family line is like departing from the kind of better known and better documented, English kind of families in New England.
And when he died, is there anything mentioned about uh, what sort of service was held? Where was he buried? Under which faith?
Oh, nothing. He's staying at a hotel. I know the Black's Hotel in Washington, D.C. He was there when he died. And, he may have owed a bill. He may have, owed them. There's nothing. So there are certainly people who knew him who were writing these eulogies. So like Theodore Ellsworth Decay, who's a naturalist who's in the next chapter, is someone who had met English. He writes one of the obituaries, but there's nowhere that I found in the archives any evidence of where he was buried. I mean, I don't know where offhand where kind of paupers or debtors would have been buried at this point in some kind of common ground, I guess. Uh, but it's kind of fascinating that someone who had played such an interesting role and had really spent a significant amount of time in the Mediterranean, really writing a lot of interesting, he when he returned from Istanbul at some point, he wrote this book, Five Pebbles from the Brook, which again was a kind of appraisal of kind of reappraisal of Christian theology, a defense of the kind of Old Testament. Uh, yeah, just gone.
Yeah. Uh, Checking if anyone else. Oh, yeah, Zainab, please come.
Hello. Generally, when we look at Western figures visiting, Ottoman lands, Eastern lands, yes, I understand Bethune comes from, Bethune English comes from military background, academic background, but they sort of can resist being involved with trade. It's sort of like a side hustle, especially he had so many, It could be, dealing in antiques, artifacts, old manuscripts, and selling them to the libraries. Is there any sort of remnants of it?
And that's a weird thing too, right? Like he's a close friend of Henry Salt, and like that's what Henry Salt is doing, right? Is like extracting Egyptian antiquities and manuscripts and material and sending them back. And there's no evidence anywhere that at any point I think maybe just English wasn't commercially minded. Like he's really interested in like learning about these places and like circulating, but he didn't make any money. Like he's always poor when he comes back to the US. He doesn't have anything. Like he's coming back to the US, instead of bringing stuff back that he's taken to sell, he's like, I want to write more books and get myself back in this theological dispute with these people who, offended me. And it's like, yeah, I don't think I've ever thought about that, but that's maybe one of the most curious things about him is he seems little concerned with, other than negotiating the treaty for the US, like for himself, he doesn't appear to be interested in anything. Like he lists that stuff in like a very perfunctory way, like here's all the products that the US could transport, but he never seems interested in like commerce or economy himself.
Yes,
I think that's because there was no wife and kids. Maybe that explains it.
He has nobody to be responsible for. He's just out there kind of adventuring around and learning things. And he comes back to the US and he's just like hoping he can get some money for the government to keep himself by. But yeah, I think that's a good point too. I think if he had had a wife, Awfully Right is certainly married. If he had had a wife or a family, he would have been perhaps more interested in like, or needed to maintain some financial stream, but he's just like getting by his wits almost. It's really curious. That's a good point. Thank you so much for helping me think about that too.
George, did you want to come in with a question or comment? George Caldes? No. Yes, I mean, I was struck too when I think you said in one of his letters, he said, where the US makes most money or the greatest interest is that in the transportation, not necessarily in the profit from the goods themselves. And I thought, okay, well, that's a big signal to set up your own shipping line, buy a ship or team up with someone who had a ship and get involved in that transportation business.
And everything everything he writes in his life is like focused on like theology and like scholastic matters. Like there is no indication that he's like, you know, yeah, setting up his own business. Like he never in anything too in his writing is there any suggestion to me that like this is all part of some scheme that he can really profit from in the long term, that he can become like Omfley.
Yes,
And that's his downfall, maybe, right?
and it seems that the word chancer comes up in my mind to describe him because he's obviously has, as we say here, the gift of the gab. Good, convince people. He's an entertainer. People find him amusing. He's got something to say, but in the end, there's no real substance, perhaps.
It's not the substance that matters and helps you avoid like a pauper's graveyard, right? Yeah.
Can I ask something about U.S. foreign policy or U.S. with the Ottomans? It's strike. I don't know if this is a fair observation, but it seems a little bit ad hoc. I mean, I wasn't sure whether the US had a clear foreign policy towards the Ottomans or whether it was more driven by we've got merchants trading and we feel obliged, and maybe the merchants were lobbying,
Yeah.
Adams and others to say, give us protection or make sure that we have permission to get through to the Black Sea. So it seemed to be a responsive approach rather than
Yeah. And I mean, that's what happens in the next chapter, right? So for the US, it's always about just getting equal commercial footing. They don't care about relations with the Ottomans, Ottoman relations with Russia or Persia. They just want their merchant ships. And again, this is the merchant class in New England who's running the country, right? Adams and others. They just want equal commercial footing so they don't have to pay as much in fees and tariffs or whatever, right? Uh, And when they do finally get this treaty a few years later, there's a huge misunderstanding, and there's a debate in the US, in the Congress, and there's a debate within the kind of Ottoman government about what this treaty means, because the US is like, oh, we send somebody to sign a commercial treaty, and the Ottomans are like, no, this treaty that we signed with you in translation means that we have a relationship between our two countries, not just your commercial vessels. So that's one of the things. So Commodore David Porter becomes the first kind of U.S. diplomatic representative to the Ottomans, and he spends like essentially the first part of his kind of tenure trying to straighten out this misunderstanding so that the Ottomans and the Americans understand like what their relationship is, what this treaty means.
Mm.
Yeah.
And another aspect was, and I'm not sure about this, but there were a number of American missionaries starting to establish themselves in the Ottoman Empire. Not sure about the timing or date. And was English involved with any of them? Because you could almost imagine him having this interest in religious matters,
Yeah.
him attaching himself to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in some way, or any
Yeah.
evidence of that?
Well, that's the thing that the book does, is the book contrasts mercenary encounters with what Heather Sharkey and others describe as missionary encounters. Uh, and these mercenary encounters, whether it's in Egypt in the 1870s, Istanbul in the 18 kind of 20s, or, Tripoli in the, early 1800s, are of a different type than missionary encounters. Missionary encounters are kind of about religion, typically, right? Uh, of course, that never, like, you can never totally remove the context of the nation and kind of global power. But mercenary encounters are almost always like quasi-state. They're about, economics, commercial relations, power. Uh, so you have some of these encounters, right? Like, he encounters Pliny Fisk, for example, and Pliny Fisk is, along with his partner Levi Parsons, who had already died at this point, attempting to set up these kind of, U.S. or American religious outposts. And, there is this kind of like fundamental conflict between the missions of mercenaries and missionaries oftentimes. Sometimes they're kind of somewhat in alignment, but often they're at odds. And one of the things that kind of Heather Sharkey has argued is that missionaries also often found themselves kind of under British or French protection, kind of, whereas kind of mercenaries, these quasi agents of state, didn't have the same protections because their mission, kind of what they're doing is at odds with those of other kind of great powers. So I think the book makes an interesting contrast because so much, I mean, that's where I came to this project from, is that so many kind of contemporary accounts of historical US relations with the Middle East, with North Africa, are, claim that really kind of formal relations began after the Cold War, right? And before that, it was mostly kind of missionaries who formed the bulk of relations between these two places. Even Edward Said argued at one point that the U.S. just wasn't interested uh, in the Levant in the 19th century. And I chose to write about all these kind of mercenary encounters because I think they do, in fact, demonstrate that the U.S. has a long and abiding interest in the Middle East, in North Africa. And in fact, these kind of mercenary encounters, in many ways, laid the foundations for U.S. relations with these places, especially during the War on Terror, when I was really kind of still writing this thing. Uh, and also the way that Americans think of these places. So many of these kind of, uh, mercenary narratives were foundational in the 19th century for how Americans thought about North Africa and the Middle East.
I mean, but could it be also that in the 19th century, America was, fourth or fifth player? The great powers, controlled it. So it's almost better to be under the radar with merchant and mercenary type operations and not trouble the Brits, the French, and the Russians too much.
Yeah, absolutely right. The US is always a kind of like minor power in all these encounters. So it's like mercenaries that become, like you say, the kind of like under the radar way to interact with, the Egyptians or the Ottoman Porte or to try to overthrow the government of Tripoli. Yeah, absolutely.
And sort of last question for me. I know we're sort of coming close to our time. What in the 19th century in the United States, what was the general awareness or perception of, let's say, the educated uh, people of the Ottoman Empire? I mean, were they familiar with goods like carpets or, you know, dried fruit, or, was there an awareness?
Yeah, I mean, and so much of the kind of historiography about, U.S. relations with the Levant, with the Ottoman Empire, with the Mediterranean, places it within the context of commercial empire. So like the U.S. kind of upper classes, educated classes would have been well familiar with the products of the Ottoman Empire of the East, right? Uh, and there's like a couple things there. I mean, there's the argument too that like both in Europe and the United States, like at the end of the 17th or 18th century, at the end of the 1700s, Americans, Europeans probably knew more accurate information about Africa, about the East than they did 100 years later, right? Kind of colonialism, the scramble for Africa transforms what was previously, uh, a much more accurate picture of those places than existed before. And I think too, thinking about Islam within the kind of Ottoman Empire, Denise Spellberg wrote a really good book about 10 years ago, Thomas Jefferson's Quran, in which she kind of analyzes, early American ideas about Islam. Uh, so that kind of, I think it's really the Greek Revolution too that shifts American ideas about. I mean, there's this moment where it would have been conceivable that the US found itself allied with the Ottomans or the Algerians against European powers. That's kind of a little earlier, before I pick up, but uh yeah, that kind of Greek Revolutionary War definitely transforms those relations also. I had something else that I wanted to say in regards to that question, but I don't remember what it was.
I just a comment. George Calder says the US were the first to open a consulate in Tangiers, mainly in the place.
I mean,
So,
Algeria is one of the first countries to recognize the US independence, so like that Algerian US relationship that had kind of gotten, dodgy by the 1820s. That was a long, friendly relationship. And in kind of again in the midst of the war on terror, there were all these books written about the Barbary Wars that really kind of positioned, Algeria, Tripoli as like these kind of like pirate states that were the original, kind of Muslim enemies of the United States. I mean, they positioned the Barbary Wars as foundational for the U.S. war on terror, right? Without, again, really kind of like looking at what really happened here. Again, Algeria, first ones to say, yep, United States, you're independent. We recognize you. That recognition of sovereignty is so important. Yeah.
fascinating. Um, so, where will your research take you next? And is there anything that we and our sort of network can help or contribute towards it?
Well, so, a lot's happened since I finished the book. So, now I'm in a teaching position with no expectations of research. So, teaching occupies a lot of my time. But in terms of the direction of the research, again, I was really interested in mercenary figures and how mercenary figures offered a new vision of the US and Africa and the Middle East in the 19th century. And that's kind of how I ended up in Nigeria. I became really interested in like, where this term mercenary even comes from. Like, how does the term mercenary function within like discourses of nationalism and so forth? And what I found is that in relationship to international law, if we think of international law as something that mostly emanates from the United Nations, at least on a more than kind of like multinational basis. It was Nigeria at the United Nations in the 1970s who introduced the first anti-mercenary protocols. And this is in the kind of context of, events in Angola, the Congo, and so forth. So at this kind of point, I'm not actively writing, but I have, a drafted manuscript, chapters, research, and so forth about Nigerian ideas about what constitutes mercenaries and mercenarism in Nigerian literature, law, and politics in the 20th century. But in terms of, the Levant, I mean, of course, I'm still interested in, George Bethune English. I'm still interested in, those kind of early relations between these two powers. And, read new, Heather Sharkey came out with a new book a couple years ago. Uh, so I'm still kind of like following the scholarship and interested, but yeah, it's hard to say what my future research looks like.
Well, certainly, if we come across things that are relevant, we'd be sure to pass them to you from maybe some family descendants in our network, may have some references somewhere to English, to having met him.
And
Um,
I am also, I will say, really interested in. So, I've tracked out these kind of mercenary encounters that happen in Turkey, right, in the kind of Central Ottoman Empire, in North Africa. But I am really interested in Palestine, in that section of the Levant. There were a few Americans who kind of tracked through there, doing surveying work around the Dead Sea. But, uh, I don't know that much about how Americans were interested in that part of the Ottoman Empire, the Arabian Peninsula. I will say, though, that one of the interesting things is I think on the eve, if we're kind of going over to the other side of the Ottoman Empire, I believe on the eve of the Civil War in Zanzibar, right? I believe I've read that the U.S. flagged ships were the most numerous ships in port there. So the U.S. also has that. Maybe that's one thing I'm definitely interested in, is thinking about the role of the US in the Indian Ocean world, right? On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, the Red Sea, right? The Persian Gulf, that area. Like what is the US? And there's actually, I think that's probably a project, but someone hasn't written a book about it or isn't writing a book. They could, because there's tons of diplomatic cables and kind of archival information that deals with the US and the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula in that part of the world, which I think is the Ottoman Empire, the edge of the Ottoman Empire in some ways, depending on when we're thinking.
Certainly that, and you raised an interesting point. The early American presence in the Levant, outside of being a missionary, it would be an interesting area to find more about. Eric, thank you ever so much. Really fascinating talk. Mysterious. I hope some new sources appear from somewhere that shed more light on English. But thank you very much for your thoughtful presentation, and we very much look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you so much. I look forward to keeping in touch also. And again, it was very gratifying to be invited here today. I thank all of you for everything.
And thank you, everybody, for coming along. And we look forward to seeing you again at one of our talks soon. Good evening.
Good evening. Bye-bye.